gosh. So I'm personally curious how you were able to insulate yourself from this conflict of interest. I mean, it's obviously some strong personal motivation that you had. So what motivated you, and then how were you on a logistical level able to do that? Because it takes funding to get these studies published. I mean, did you do it philanthropically out of your own funds, or were you able to find some organization to fund your trials and studies and research?
Well, I would say some of both. I mean, my income definitely goes toward my research. And we've had, we did actually have one sizable NIH randomized trial that was funded without drug company. It was sizable, but not on the scale of multiple thousands, but it did have 1,000 individuals. And I got a small award from Robert Wood Johnson General Physician Faculty Scholar Award, none of which went to my own income, but went to support a project that I thought was important, although it was intended to go to me. Yes, and we now have a Department of Defense funded small study looking at coenzyme Q10 in Gulf War veterans. So we've had funding from a few different sources over time, and are desperately looking for other ways to get funding. And we've also had small donations from some subjects who've had adverse effects on statins who felt helped by our work, and that's been really nice. The amounts of money are quite small, but.
Well, it's quite fascinating, the details you've been able to uncover, and I'm wondering what if you've come to any conclusions or have any ideas, suggestions, if there's any hope for this whole system. Is it recoverable? Is it modifiable? I mean, you've got these policies in place that are really name only, that are clearly, from the examples you've given, just really ignored, and more than ignored, they're violently non-implemented. Can the system change, or is it permanently broken?
Well, I think there are a number of things that could be done that would mitigate the problems. And since there are already these clinical trial registries, why not add something else to that? So right now, federally funded studies in principle, meaning NIH-funded studies, for example, in principle are supposed to, if they're large enough studies, are supposed to be willing to make their data public access, publicly available, after some time after the study is completed. Why not demand, as part of entering your trial entry registry, that you make those data publicly available a certain time? Now, this doesn't completely protect against willful manipulation of data, but if people are not willfully manipulating the evidence, then at least those data will become available whether or not the drug company chooses to publish them themselves. So that's one thing I think should happen.
And the reason for this is that as a committed clinician, academic clinician who's seeking to identify the truth, or people like you in this position, it's virtually impossible to do that, because when you read the scientific paper, many of our listeners have never done that because it's a different language for them, it's basically impossible to analyze it because they don't include the data sets. Is that the reason you're suggesting this?
That's right. And there's extremely strong evidence that they're, doing some form of selecting the favorable outcomes or something like it. And we have very good evidence for this from head-to-head trials of different classes of drugs. So there's one article that was very cleverly entitled Why Olanzapine Beats Risperidone Beats Quetiapine, and Quetiapine Beats Olanzapine, an analysis of head-to-head trials of second-generation antipsychotics. And basically what they found was, with these drugs that are basically in the same class and have approximately the same likelihood of benefit, whoever funded the study, their drug came out on top, about 90% of the time. And there was a similar analysis of head-to-head trials of statin drugs, in which the odds for the results being favorable toward whichever company funded the study were 20-1, and the odds for the conclusions being favorable were 35-1. And so this makes it extremely clear that, if you have two drugs that are approximately equal, you can make either one look better, either by selecting your outcomes or by whatever other processes. And this poses an extremely frightening question. If you can create odds so high favoring a drug over one that it's inherently no superior to, what implications does that have if that other drug is called placebo?
Yes, indeed. Well, you've done a masterful job in uncovering the process that is typically used to promote these drugs. And I'm wondering, the beginning of the process, however, starts when physicians are educated in medical school. And that's when they start the brainwashing, from my experience. And I'm wondering if you've found or what you've uncovered in that perspective, and how the medical students are typically initiated in this process and oriented to this perspective.
Right. Well, I think there are several issues there. One is that most of the physicians who are doing the training are all conditioned by the existing literature and the existing, quote, expertise, which is influenced by all the factors that we just mentioned, so that they legitimately believe, the benefits of these drugs, often to a degree that's not even supported by the published randomized trial evidence, because it will be supported by the follow-on review papers, commentary, expertise, and guidelines. But I will say that, medical students have actually been on the vanguard of trying to make change. And the American Medical Student Association actually developed a policy of trying to rate the impact of conflict of interest in the classroom. And my understanding is that this was motivated initially by a medical student at Harvard who had listened actually to their lecture on statins, and somebody in the classroom had raised their hand and asked a question about statin adverse effects. And it was answered in such a derisory and dismissive way that this other student, went up and looked up the lecture online and discovered that he had all these conflicts of interest with statin industry. And that ended up prompting, the student group to try to take action. And I'd actually have to look more into the details of what that action is. But my understanding is that initially Harvard received an F rating, but it was later upgraded, I can't recall, to a B or an A. I don't really know if the processes that were put in place, how much they do to remedy that situation. But at least, it's taking a step in the right direction. And I will say that I certainly had the impression that the lectures that are on statins had to be extremely strongly biased, because my husband and I had dinner with a colleague of my husband's whose daughter was at Harvard Medical School at the time. And he shared with us that the day they had their lecture on statins, his daughter called him up and said, "Dad, make sure the day I turn 30, you call me up and remind me to start statins." And that the randomized trial evidence does not support benefit to the patient, that is, to outcomes that balance benefits and risk like mortality or all-cause serious morbidity in any group of women, even women with heart disease. It's, it would take a fairly strongly slanted lecture for her to have come to this conclusion. So I think those issues do begin in medical school. I will say that both for medical school and also graduate school, there really is very limited training on how to evaluate evidence. Mm-hmm. There's very, very limited training in epidemiology methods, forms of bias, confounding, selection effects, and also logical fallacies, which are frankly rife in medical articles.
Yeah, and this one somewhat surprising that you were able to, garner your expertise, because as you mentioned, this really is not traditionally taught. You have to acquire it in some other field, because they're not going to teach you in almost every medical school. And the very, to me, this seems one of the most foundational skills to learn, because I remember from my medical education, they said 95% of what you're going to learn in school is going to be outdated by the time you're practicing. So you really do need a skill set to help you evaluate all this new research, and yet they aren't giving you the tools or training you the tools on how to evaluate the data sets.
I absolutely share that conviction with you. In fact, it's my opinion that starting in grade school, that should be like English and math should be one of the key things that is taught, and it should be taught and upgraded essentially throughout one's education, much less for people who have a career in science or in medicine. I completely agree with you on that.